Hi, I'm Robin. Thank you for tuning in. I've got something very important to share with you today. In the previous videos, we talked about how a persistent stress response, that's a stress switch that's stuck in the on position, can lead to a variety of health conditions in many different areas of life. Today, we're going to specifically talk about the impact of stress and the stress response on the cardiovascular system. As we've mentioned previously, the stress response is mainly related to two powerful hormones, and that's adrenaline and cortisol. In this context today, adrenaline is the one that we are going to talk about in more detail. So if the stress switch gets stuck in the on position, one of the impacts of that system on the body is that our heart rate increases. That obviously makes sense. We want to have more cardiovascular output. This is good for muscle function and gets us ready if we need to run away or attack. And ultimately, that with the increased heart rate, that puts additional stress on the cardiovascular system. Now, the adrenaline also has other different functions. For example, that it leads to the constriction of some of the small blood vessels. In return, our blood pressure increases, and that can be measured with the diastolic blood pressure as well, that in people who are affected by a persistent stress response, they do have elevated blood pressure and often have a history of increased blood pressure as well. So it's something that's very easily measurable as well. Now, over time, unfortunately, the increased adrenaline in the body leads to some damage of the small blood vessels as well. And this is the bit that's going to be important as we're talking about how the cardiovascular system is negatively impacted by that as well. Before we go into more detail, we have to talk about one of the main causes of cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular incidences, which is called atherosclerosis. And this is a process that is well documented where in the walls of the arteries there's a little bit of a space where plaque can accumulate, and this plaque attracts immune cells of the body, macrophages, and they go into that space and they try to eat that plaque. And unfortunately, in those circumstances, they overeat a little bit, and they eat so much until they burst, and they end up creating more plaque. And that extra plaque attracts more macrophages, and they kind of keep stacking up until the space between the arteries gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and then it hardens. And under certain circumstances, little bits and pieces of that hardened plaque can break off and get released into the bloodstream. And if the piece of plaque is big enough to go into a blood vessel that is tiny, it can obstruct that blood vessel completely, and in a worst case scenario lead to a stroke, for example, where the blood flow to that area of the brain or other parts of the body is completely obstructed, and blood is not flowing through there anymore. So the mechanism for atherosclerosis is well described, but people do not know with 100% certainty yet why the body is doing that and where it's coming from. And things such as bad diet or increased weight or obesity and alcohol consumption and smoking specifically, those are all contributing factors, but they're not what is causing it. And now in recent times, there's been a lot of links that were established between the stress response and atherosclerosis, and this is what we're going to talk about now. So like I said, the adrenaline unfortunately starts damaging those smaller blood vessels, and there's especially one layer called the endothelium, which is impacted by that, and where it's suggested that damaging of the blood vessel itself by the adrenaline, that attracts more of those macrophages, which then try to eat away at the plaque, then it bursts, and then it just spirals out of control. So it's definitely one of the established contributing factors to that as well. Then the other thing that we were talking about is that due to the adrenaline increasing the heart rate and overall trying to increase the cardiovascular output, in addition to with the increased blood pressure, the heart has to work a lot harder in order to just maintain our homeostasis day in and day out. And the reason that's important is the more stress is being put on the cardiovascular system, the more stress is put on the heart muscles as well. Unfortunately, that can lead to cardiovascular fatigue as well, heart muscle damage, and then the system being overloaded and ultimately potentially leading to heart attacks as well. So there's two serious complications that are related to the stress response where the links are very well established. And previously, like I said, atherosclerosis was something that was a little bit mysterious, even though it's well documented how it works, why it comes about, was less documented. And now we know that there is a hard link to the stress response as well. So this is important for you to know. If you have had cardiovascular incidences in the past, if you know that you're affected by high blood pressure, it is worthwhile getting checked out for evidence of a persistent stress response. The team and myself very much do whatever we can is in our power to help you out, and ideally we would love to see you for an assessment. Thank you so much for listening in today. All the best, and we look forward to seeing you soon.